Okay, welcome everyone. Welcome everyone to this Studium Generale lecture on debate on inequality, the impact of inequality and the causes of inequality. We have four very eminent speakers tonight, which I'll introduce. Well, first, very briefly about myself. I'm a university lecturer at the University of Cambridge. I'm a regional economist and I work on labour markets, well-being, and more recently, quality of work and the differences across regions in those areas. So I will introduce the four speakers. First, we have Professor Dimitris Ballas, who's a professor of economic geography at the University of Groningen. And in fact, we had his professorial lecture yesterday, which is why we're all here. Dimitris works on the geography of happiness and well-being and trying to answer the question, does geography matter for our well-being and what explains geographical differences in happiness and well-being? Dimitris has published widely in the fields of social and economic geography, social and spatial inequalities, regional science, and geoinformatics in the social sciences. The next speaker is Professor Danny Dorling, who's a professor of geography at the University of Oxford and a fellow of St. Peter's College in Oxford. His work is on a range of topics: housing, health, employment, education and poverty. In his talk today, he will talk about his latest book, Peak Inequality, more specifically about the relationship between politics and various aspects of inequality. Then we have Professor Kate Picket, who is a professor of epidemiology at the University of York, and I'll introduce them both together, and Professor Richard Wilkinson, who's a professor of emeritus in social epidemiology at the University of Nottingham, and they will give a talk on inequality and well-being, focusing specifically on mental illness and other aspects of health. So I don't want to take up too much time with my own thoughts. Just briefly to say that inequality is very clearly one of the most important issues of our time, both in terms of trying to explain why we have rising inequality, what causes it, and what the consequences are, and also very importantly, what can we do about it. So without further ado, I will invite the first speaker, Beatrice Ballas. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Maria. And thank you, everyone, for being here. Being here is great to have a full house. As Maria said, I have given my inaugural lecture yesterday on the economic geography of happiness and well-being. Today, I will draw on some of the things that I've been working on and give an overview of, within the next 10 minutes, of the geography of happiness and well-being, what matters when it comes to happiness, and to what extent geography may be important. And I would argue, as from an economic geography perspective, it's one of the most important and hot topics at the moment is inequality, social and spatial inequalities, social context, the extent to which we compare ourselves with other people, inequality, income inequality, power inequality at different geographical levels. There is ongoing work in this area. I will give you a flavor. I would like to start by discussing some maps. You can already see a map from a recent book on the Human Atlas of Europe, co-authored with my very good friend and colleague Danny Dorling, sitting next to me, and Benjamin Henning at the University of Iceland, who was with us yesterday, but he had to go back to Iceland this morning. Some of you may be familiar with these maps. You might have also been. I did give a Studium Generale lecture back in February with a topic on a country called Europe. The idea behind this work is that we, as three geographers, social scientists coming from, originally I come from Greece, as you might be able to tell from my very strong Greek accent and my name. Danny is from Oxford and Ben is from Germany, now in Iceland, but we both feel very strongly that we are Europeans above everything else in terms of national identity. So we felt that we would engage with the current debates about Europe by producing an atlas as geographers of Europe. And today I'm using some of the maps in this book. The book is using an innovative method human cartography and geographical information systems too. You may not be that familiar with this kind of mapping, but the idea is to resize every area or country according to a variable of interest. So instead of focusing on land, we focus on the things that we want to highlight, and we would argue that it makes more sense in many applications to use this method. And this is the map of happiness in Europe, and every country is resized according to the total number of people who, according to social surveys, said that they are very happy. Okay? So they are asked, would you be, I could perhaps repeat the question, ask you, I don't want obviously to say it, but if you were asked in a social survey, are you very happy, quite happy, happy or not very happy, what would you say? So this is one of the ways in which happiness could be measured, and this is how you could map it. And the Netherlands is a very happy country, as you may know, according to a lot of these surveys. The size, this is total, every country is resized according to how many very happy people are there. And the Netherlands is nearly as big as Germany, because for some reason Germany in these surveys doesn't have that, it's a much bigger country, but it doesn't have very many happy people there for some reason, according to this survey. So just an example. And the Netherlands is also on the top of the list of happiness in terms of, as a proportion of the total population. So more than half of the inhabitants of the Netherlands say that they're very happy. So this is one of the ways where we can explore the geography of happiness and well-being. Very briefly, if you might be wondering about the color code, the idea, as I said, is to map Europe as one place, and we consider all countries that are members of the European Union or have a strong commitment or are candidate members and so on and so forth. You may find the Studium Generale lecture I referred to earlier is online. There's a video, so you may find more information if you're interested in the background to this work, and find more about how these maps work and why we use this coloring scheme. And we mapped Europe according to a number of variables. This is happiness. And before I continue, I'd like to ask you, why would you say the Netherlands is on top of the list in terms of happiness? Is it, if you were to consider factors that affect happiness at different levels, Groningen, the Netherlands, regional, and so on, we could start thinking about things that happen at the regional level, country level, and so on. One obvious question when you think of geography is, and some people ask me, I'm originally from Greece, and say, why don't you miss the sunshine? Would you say the weather affects happiness? Would the Netherlands be a happy place because of the weather? I don't know. I mean, that's a map of rainfall across our continent, total rainfall in a year, how much rain falls on land. And using the same method, we can also look at how much rain falls on people's heads. So there's a lot of rain falling on the heads of Dutch people, perhaps, across, on average, compared to especially the south of Europe. So you might argue, if we assume that rain is not something that makes us happy, perhaps the weather is not what makes the Netherlands a very happy country, right? Possibly, I don't know. Maybe some people like the rain. Other things that affect the way we measure happiness pertain to also cultural and linguistic issues in some countries mapped in the atlas, like, for example, France. It is argued that people are less likely to say they are happy for cultural reasons, whereas in countries like the United States, where people are thought to be more likely to say they are very happy. It's even in the Constitution of the United States. So there's this dimension as well when we compare happiness between places, right? But even within countries, there are linguistic issues and cultural issues. So, for example, in Groningen, I've been here for a year now, and one of the first expressions I heard I learned was something you use when you are asked, how are you? And if a person from Groningen was to say that they are very happy, they would say, kon minder. Which means, for those of you who are not Dutch, it means it could be less, it could be worse, it's not too bad. So it doesn't sound very positive. But it is a person in Groningen saying kon minder would mean they are very happy. In Amsterdam or Rotterdam, probably not, I don't know, it may not mean anything. So there are all these issues, and in addition to that, if we start thinking about what matters, I would argue, as I said very briefly at the beginning, social and spatial inequality, social cohesion, welfare, these are things that are extremely important, and you might argue that the Netherlands is doing relatively well in many of these areas, even though a lot more could be done. And my fellow colleagues and speakers today will provide more evidence about inequality. But it has long been argued that inequality is extremely important with regards to human well-being and happiness, going back from a theoretical point of view as far as back as Aristotle, perhaps, and then more recently Adam Smith, Karl Marx. And as a spatial scientist and economic geographer, you could explore this further. So I have a number of questions here. The first one is heavily researched by economists of happiness, as they are known now. What matters at the individual level, how many friends we have, income, socioeconomic status, education. But then we're very interested to see to what extent inequality matters, to what extent what we have relates to what other people have. If social comparisons are important, what is the level at which we compare ourselves at different points in time? People compare themselves with their friends at school, for example, where you are at, within a city, within a region, within a country, within a continent. So these are questions that can be explored, and we will be discussing this today. And I'm just giving you a flavor of what kind of research topics are currently quite prominent in the social science, in the spatial science and economic geography. And you could argue, you could start asking the questions, is it context, is it inequality, or is it what we have as individuals? And we can start exploring and mapping issues that, in addition to the weather, we can look at social cohesion. This is poverty at the regional level using the same method. We can look at a number of factors, especially relating to inequality. London, for instance, is the most affluent city region in Europe and possibly the world, but it also has a very high poverty rate, higher than poverty rates in Greece, I think, in many occasions. Because inequality is so high, so you could start thinking, when you are in Groningen, what is the social cohesion here compared to London, compared to Brussels, and how does this affect your happiness and well-being? Also, change is very important, not only poverty or unemployment, but also massive change. So in the last 10 years, there has been a lot of changes. The economic crisis resulted in massive increases in unemployment across different parts of Europe. This also has a massive impact on well-being and inequality. Some examples are shown here. Disposable income. It's not just how much income you have, but how much of it is dropping. And also comparing social justice, social spatial justice. All these things are extremely important. I'm only giving a flavor here. And these maps we can possibly maybe discuss during the question and answer session later. So some more illustrations with regards to austerity, for example, inequality, the economic crisis and well-being, measured well-being at the regional level. This is an example of one of the countries that have been heavily affected by the economic crisis, and there has been a sense of that things have not been done in a just way, that is social injustice, as well as the drop of living standards. And also to conclude, I'd like to argue that inequality and happiness are also related to spatial interdependence of happiness and feelings of solidarity. We feel our happiness is affected by the happiness of others. Our happiness is affected by the happiness of our friends, our partner, our family, but also people in other parts of the country, other parts of the world. And a very good example is the amazing manifestations of solidarity with regards to the refugee crisis. Before moving to Groningen, I was in the island of Lesbos at the University of the Aegean, and I've witnessed amazing manifestations of solidarity by local people, but also from people from all over the world, with a quite high number of Dutch people coming and still there to help. So you could argue that people feel they're not happy when they see suffering, and there's very strong evidence, and increasingly we have data to actually quantify the suffering and the impact on inequality. So I would like to conclude with that, and I look forward to more discussion and questions. So thank you for your attention. I think I stick 1 minute over, I think. So.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, so we have some time for questions now. We are going to have a few questions after each speaker and then a debate at the end as well. So does anybody have any questions for Dimitris?
Hi, thank you for a very interesting presentation. You said that you analyze happiness from the European perspective and all the things that influence happiness. Do you think, for example, moving a little bit away from Europe, for example, Bhutan is a country that has as a national policy national happiness. do you think, for example, the aspects that they consider for national happiness could be something that could be used or implemented in other countries?
Yeah, thank you. That's a very interesting point. I'm not really that familiar with Bhutan as a country. I know that they are focusing on happiness, and that's a great thing. I mean, it's very important to understand what makes people happy, and I think they would identify inequality as a key factor. So the fact that they're actually engaging with this is extremely positive, and I think this should be done also across the world and in Europe. Although we have to be careful when we measure happiness to make sure that we do it properly, taking into account of cultural variations, making sure we use the right measure, because sometimes you could argue that if it's not done properly, it could be used by politicians to say that, for example, a regressive policy in terms of taxation is not that bad because people are still happy. We need to scrutinize that, and there's a lot to learn. But I think in Bhutan, as long as they focus on the hard evidence, it's a positive thing. I'm not that familiar with, I think there are issues of democracy and human rights. I think this is something that needs to be looked at, but I think there are other people in this room that may know more about Bhutan than I do. But to just take a message is that it's positive that they focus on happiness, and if they do it properly, they will probably reach the right conclusions, and we should all do that.
So maybe I can add a quick follow-up question. What is stopping us from doing that? If from having happiness as a goal, policy goal? I
think it's increasingly happening. So there is a regional statistical agencies across Europe. They measure happiness. These maps as one of the examples. So I think we are getting there, but I am sometimes a bit skeptical of some politicians that do not sound. I don't think they have the happiness of the people at heart when they say that they would like to have this measure. I think we need more scrutiny. But I think to some extent we are doing this, but we have to be careful to make sure we do it right. But
there's another question just behind.
Thank you. Well, I have a question. The things you mentioned, I relate them to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I'm not sure whether you're familiar with that. But how would you relate happiness to this pyramid?
Yeah, I think it's extremely relevant. That's an excellent point. My colleague Dorling, sitting next to me, has published a book on well-being and how governments can make us happy, which starts with this pyramid and discusses this quite extensively. So I think it's extremely relevant, but I think once we fulfill all our needs, I think it's also important to consider social justice and socio-spatial justice. So I think from any geography perspective, we can explore that further. It's very important to meet all the needs that are extremely important, but we also need to take into account of context, socio-spatial context, and make sure that we have an income inequality and wealth inequality, which is, I don't know if you could use the word acceptable, but reduce it as much as possible and engage with it as a topic as much as possible.
Danny, do you want to say something?
About well, I'll say Maslow's needs are very interesting. Maslow was quite an individualistic economist. It was all about what was good for you. So he wasn't great on society as a whole. I'll say a little bit more about happiness when I do my talk. The only other thing I'll say to embarrass him is I actually dedicated this book to Dimitris because he's the happiest person I know. So I thought. And there is an enormous amount of individual variation in these things. Whether you are personally happy or personally find you're more likely to be depressed is actually bad luck and individual. When we look at countries, we say this country is happier, this country is sadder. It's about the average for the country. Individual human beings, some of us are lucky, some are unlocked, and your personalities may be somewhat fixed. And fascinatingly, they vary between siblings. So if you have brothers or sisters, all of you will have a brother and sister who tends to either be happier than you or less happy than you. And it's interesting to think about that difference, because often you were brought up exactly the same or in a very similar way to the same family. So happiness is a fascinating thing. Richard and Kate are going to talk much more about this generally, but it's just worth remembering all of us individually have this variation. often we can't do that much about, but you're a very lucky man because you are very happy.
Okay, so shall we take another question? I think there was one.
Hi, thank you for your very interesting talk. Because it was very interesting, I should ask, how do you define happiness? I mean, if it is only self-proclaimed happiness, if I say I'm happy, then you consider myself happy? Or do you have a very specific way to measure happiness?
Yeah, that's a very good point. There are many definitions you could adopt. Obviously, for the purpose of this lecture, I use a very simple the response to a question like how happy are you? Very happy, quite happy, not so happy, unhappy. There is ongoing research. You can do a PhD thesis on how you should measure happiness. I think it is important to also consider the extent to which people fulfill their potential in life, engage with capabilities and potential. But even questions like the response to these questions are extremely correlated with other measures. But overall, there is a need for more research on what is the best measure of happiness, and depending on what you want to do, you should have different definitions. So I guess I don't really have a direct answer for you, but there are different options. It depends on what you want to do.
Thanks.
Are there any other more questions? Just
I would like to thank you as well for your talk. The question I have, suppose you were the Minister of Happiness in Germany, the country you mentioned specifically. What would be the first step to increase happiness?
I think with regards to addressing social and spatial inequality and enhancing social cohesion, I would say spend more money on research and actually implementing policies such as basic income policies, which is a universal income. There was a very extremely interesting Studium Generale event a couple of weeks ago, I think it was. The video should be up on basic income as an idea. I think this is really the future for highly advanced, developed economies. And that's a way of addressing, making sure that everybody is independent economically. Even the wealthier people will be happy, as I would argue, and my colleagues in this panel have provided very strong evidence suggesting that even the very rich people, they are better off in a more equal, if their income is reduced, in order to have a more social cohesive outcome. So if I were the Minister for Happiness in Germany, I would say spend more money on basic income experiments like what happened in Finland. There are excellent experiments in the Netherlands at the moment, although you're not supposed to use the word basic income. It's social assistant experiments that are not, strictly speaking, basic income, but it is the right direction. And our faculty, and I have very good colleagues who are here today, they are at the forefront of research, groundbreaking research in this, how basic income and similar policies could enhance social cohesion and how this relates to well-being and happiness. So I would say that would be the top priority for me, basic income.
great. Okay, maybe I can ask the same question to the rest of the panel.
If I was advising the minister in Germany, I would say look at the 5 or 6 happiest countries in the world by the World Happiness Index. So look at Norway, look at Finland, see what they're doing, which Germany is not doing. It's not very far away from Germany. Germany is doing quite well as a country, certainly compared to the UK, as I'll tell you about later. We look at Germany with envy. But learn lessons from other countries. There are countries that do better than Germany, and ask what they are doing, which isn't done in Germany, and try to emulate it. I don't know what you do if you're already in somewhere like Finland, and Finland scores top on something like 30 or 40 world indicators of happiness and well-being. It's ridiculous. So the advice I can't give is what on earth do you do if you're Finland? It must be very annoying to be that good.
I think we would say that perhaps happiness is not the metric we would want to focus on the most, and that we'd want a more holistic measure of well-being. But I agree with Danny, there are so many examples of places around the world where policies are different, politics are different, and people are more or less happy or healthy, or have different levels of well-being. But there's often a sort of a stubbornness about wanting to learn from other countries. I think we're particularly stubborn in the UK about looking to places that are doing better than us and learning from them. We tend to look at the country that actually does worse than us and borrow all kinds of policies from the United States, you know, which is the only place that sort of outclasses us in stupid policy. So being a little smarter and being evidence-based in policy making, I think, is the way to go.
Yes, I too would perhaps choose other metrics. So people have suggested that life expectancy or death rates are a better indicator of well-being and happiness than people's answers to questions about happiness. I think there's a big gap between what people say and the actual conditions of their lives and more objective measures.
Okay. So we have time for maybe one or two quick questions. I think there was one in the front. Is that? No? Okay.
Oh, hi. I might just well stand up because I also won't see me, but reading those words, solidarity, this sucks though. Solidarity is kind of like a tricky thing because I think, for example, imagine a refugee crisis, some groups, especially villages, see others as a kind of threat of their solidarity, and this also leads to satisfaction. I kind of wonder, well, this also pertains to places, so maybe you can respond to that. Do you take this into account in measuring happiness, or you kind of remain neutral on the issue, or you try to?
Can you repeat the issue is that some areas feel threatened, or what was the?
Well, imagine like a village in Germany, like 3,000 people living there, and then suddenly empty building gets filled with 1,000 people of Syria, for example.
Yeah.
Not only do these people are dissatisfied with the situation, they never experienced such a new coming before. Even their house prices get decreased because nobody even wants to live there.
Okay.
So I can't talk for them, of course, but these people are obviously dissatisfied. And would you take this into account?
Yes, but I think what you describe is not related to the refugee issue. It's not an issue of refugees. Any place in anywhere, if you live in a village of 300 with a population of 300 and you have 3,000 people from the rest of the country coming or from a neighboring country, you have an issue with capacity and resources. This is a problem of management. It's not an issue with people being refugees or being from Syria or wherever. It's an issue of not managing this properly. So I think there's a lot of media misrepresentation of what has been going on. If we think of the refugees as a total number of refugees, I think in Turkey at the moment there are 3 million. If we were to accommodate them across Europe, if every village and city in Europe were to take a few families, it's not really a big number. It's not they don't have to go all in one village. I don't see why. But in any case, this is not an issue of refugees. It's an issue of managing your planning and management your space accordingly. And also in terms of values, I think what you're saying, a lot of people may say we feel threatened because these people don't share our values. I get this question a lot. I would say, if we think of our values, I think what is most alien in Europe at the moment to our values as Europeans is neo-Nazi parties and extremist parties. They have much more in common with extremist groups in the countries where refugees are fleeing than, we have much more in common with refugees. So I think we need to consider all that, and of course it is important, but I would say, just to go to your original point, it's an issue of management. Of course it's a problem, but we can do it I think Europe has a capacity to actually, the number of refugees is not very big. It's really not, it shouldn't be an issue.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
So maybe one last question. I think there was one just here.
Thank you. It was an interesting talk. Given a scenario, if it has to be GDP versus GDH, right? So the discussion going on for a long time. So it's a gross domestic product versus gross domestic happiness. Personally, what would you pick?
Well, I would say, and my colleagues in this panel have provided extremely strong evidence for, especially for more advanced economies, GDP growth doesn't really add to your happiness. You have to focus on really other things, including income inequality and social cohesion. And measuring happiness is important because we can further add to the evidence that inequality is detrimental to happiness. So I would say measure happiness, but also measure inequality, because we know increasingly that this is a key factor that decreases our happiness. Even if you are wealthy, you don't want to be in an unequal country or unequal region.
Right. And is democracy a prerequisite for happiness?
I would say, yeah, it is very important to have a freedom of speech, freedom of expression, and accountability. I would say yes, it is associated. And inequality, I think, in countries that are not democracies are very likely to have extreme inequality as well, because you don't have accountability. You have if you look at dictatorships, you have a very high inequality. So, in addition to obvious issues such as human rights and freedom of expression and all that, linking into inequality again, saying it really coldly, it is, if you don't have democracy, you are more likely to have high inequality as well.
So if I can take that,
yeah.
It's the last question, I just give
very, very
so is it true in that case, the 17th century, people were unhappy because there were not many democratic countries?
Well, we don't have any surveys, but yeah, I would say they wouldn't be very happy. No, I mean.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so I would like to invite the next speaker, Danny Dorling.
Thank you very much for the invitation to speak here. I'm going to speak for just 10 minutes. I'll start off with a question at the back, actually, before I get on to peak inequality, because I think it's interesting. The last couple of days I've been here, a lot of people have talked to me about immigration. And I'm mainly going to talk to you about how bad things are in the UK and how wonderful they were when I was a child in the 1970s. Mm-hmm. But there was something which was very bad in the UK in the 1970s. We were a far more racist country than we are today. My experience of this, the defining moment of my childhood, was waking up one day when I was about 9 years old and finding that somebody had sprayed a very large swastika on the side of my house. And the reason they sprayed a swastika on the side of my house was that two of my brothers were black. I was a mixed-raced family, and we'd moved into an area which was all white. So why did the National Front in this case worry about my brothers? Before we moved into the estate called Risinghurst in Oxford, there were 2 black children, and when we moved in, there were 4 black children. Now, what you need to know about Oxford is that it was a car plant city. There was a very small university that was very unimportant and a bit snobby, but the main thing that the town did is make cars. 40,000 people worked in the car plant. And they were worried about their jobs. And they were worried that the immigrants were going to take their jobs in the car plant. The car plant had what was called a colour bar in the 50s. Black men were not allowed to work in the car factory, and that went. But the big fear was the integration and what will happen with these Afro-Caribbean people coming into the city. Nowadays, everybody in England has a black friend, and nobody would complain about Afro-Caribbean people at all. And the car plant only employs 3,000 people, not 40,000 people, because the cars are made by robots. And it doesn't matter what you had done, there would be no jobs in the car factory. And it was all very sad. But when I hear debates across Europe now about immigration, I just remember being a child and the stupidity of it. And I think how many Syrian children in Europe will be telling stories in 40 years' time about what happened to them and how stupid people were in Europe to think that they were a problem at all. Peak inequality, good news and happiness. The argument here is that we may have reached a peak of inequality. We may have reached one worldwide. We may have reached one in the UK, possibly in the USA. And this is different from what, say, Thomas Piketty says. Thomas Piketty says the world is very unequal, we had a brief moment of greater equality, and now we're back to big inequality, and it'll get worse, and it'll be very hard to solve. This graph is not mine, it's from a book I wrote a couple of years ago, and I will zoom in a bit so you can actually see it. The argument, and I'm afraid I'm going to talk about Britain a bit too much, is that inequality doesn't necessarily carry on rising forever. You can change things, and the fact that almost all the political leaders of the world, from the Pope to Barack Obama to the President of China to Christine Lagarde at the IMF to the business leaders at Davos, all at some point in the last 10 years said inequality along with climate change is the biggest problem in the world. It's not all hot air. It actually has an effect. Of all the academics in the world, the two academics who've had the most effect on inequality are Richard and Kate. Somebody had to. They wrote a book in 2009 called The Spirit Level. It was the right time and it was the right book. And I'm going to show you some numbers to suggest that things are getting better. But when things begin to get better, they don't feel very much better. And the other thing, if you've read to the bottom of the slide, is I'm going to give you a challenge, because one problem we have when we study inequality is that countries which have the greatest equality don't shout about it and always worry about the problems they have. So today we were told about the problem of your government, the problem of the taxes and so on. And here we are in a town where we can only dream of having cycle lanes like this, or houses like this, or a university like this. And of course people always complain. You could have complained in 1725. The United Provinces was the most unequal place in the world in 1725. The top dog, the richest place in the world, tends to be the most unequal. Inequality is very expensive. What you're seeing here is a Gini coefficient, so I've got to very quickly explain what a Gini coefficient is. Imagine that all of you on this side of the room live in a household, in a family, where you're receiving 75,000 euros a year. And think about what kind of holiday you could have, what you could afford to buy, 75,000 euros a year. And all of you are on 25,000 euros a year. That's for you and your family and your children, 25. The very simple way to work out a Gini coefficient if you have two families is you take one away from the other, so we get a difference of 50,000 euros, and you divide by the total, 75 plus 25 is 100,000, and you get a Gini of 0.5. And that is Mexico. That is South Africa, that is Brazil at the moment. You could all have a cleaner. You don't need to clean your kitchen, you don't need to clean your bedrooms, you'd pay for a cleaner. And one of you would be the cleaner, and you would go and clean our houses. So when you're looking at that scale, 50 to 40, that's the kind of inequalities you're talking, and I'll show you some other numbers now. I won't describe why it did. This is historical data. But the United States, the 13 colonies, were the most equal place in the world. One of the most equal in 1725. A bit later, they had the tallest people in the United States. Today, you have the tallest people, and you have great equality. And you can see right at the very end where you are. This graph is over a long time period, so it's truncated the last 3 or 4 decades into a tiny amount of space. But it is quite incredible what's happened in the Netherlands, and it is quite incredible in contrast to what's happened in the UK. This graph is showing the take of the best off 1%. Switzerland is actually average for Europe, not bad. Bankers in London are paid twice as much as bankers in Switzerland. But the Netherlands, you've managed to achieve a rate of equality. You've got the 1% down to what they had in the UK when I was a child. And apart from the racism, which was bad, everything else was pretty good when I was a child. People went to the nearest school. You didn't worry about what school you went to. The houses were cheap. You could all start a family and so on. I got to go through this next bit very quickly because I run out of time. In fact, I'll let you look at the numbers. I won't read them out. These are the Gini coefficients from the OECD. They're the best data we have for inequality each year. If there isn't a number, it's because the country hasn't reported it. And I've put a box around the highest year. It is very, very early to call this, but you'll notice that very often 2013 was worse than 2014 was worse than 2015. Not in every case, but in most countries of the world, since people said inequality is a huge problem, it has actually started to come down ever so slightly. And I think this matters because otherwise you can think, what is the point of doing all this? Politicians lie, they never actually do what they say. But across the world, let's go for the next set of countries. Across the world, you can see that we're not rising up again. And of course, in some of these countries, it is very low. Rich countries have the lowest inequality in the world. Equality is a feature of wealth. It is an achievement. You don't become a wealthy country without becoming more equal. You can't become a wealthy country if you have half your population living on 3 times less than the other half. It doesn't actually work. Last set of countries, even in the United Kingdom, even in the United States, although that may change, he's really trying to make it more unequal again. Even in the United States, we're actually beyond a local peak of inequality. And it's not what Picket said would happen. So why is it falling? Well, in the UK, inequality is falling because incomes are falling most at the very top. Here, and of course, nobody worries about bankers who were paid £10 million a year now being paid £5 million a year. The European Banking Authority records the number of bankers paid over €1 million a year. We have about 2,700 bankers paid over €1 million a year in the UK. The next highest is 191 in London. We have this ridiculous collection of overpaid bankers. And of course, it's making our country do very well, he says. What banking salaries have been falling the last few years. Nobody worries about it. That's the kind of thing you need to reduce inequality. But at the other end of the scale, things are also getting worse in the UK. Here are some statistics showing that we're going from about a third of children in lone parent houses living in poverty to around about this year 2/3. Huge cuts to benefits at the bottom of the scale in the UK, but actually not as big cuts as at the top. The way in which countries most often become more equal is when they have a disaster. Losing a war is the fastest way to become more equal. Losing a war is brilliant because it doesn't feel like it, but the one thing that definitely happens when you lose a war is you get rid of the old elite. You do not allow the people who used to govern your country to govern it again. And whenever you do that, they lose their corruption, their power, their land, and things are spread out more equally. This is what happened in Germany, it's what happened in Japan. The UK is unlucky because it hasn't lost a war for a very long time. We were quietly invaded in 1688 by some people from the Netherlands. We call it a glorious revolution, but that's the last time somebody took over control of the UK. What does peak inequality look like? In most of the world, apart from the United States, inequality last peaked in the year 1913, the year before the First World War. So we have to go back then to see what a peak looks like and feels like. This photograph was taken at the annual Harrow-Eton cricket match. It's a cricket match that happens every year in England. It still happens. If you knew your English dress, you would know that those young men are from Harrow because they have the hat and the cane. If you see pictures of Winston Churchill and look at his hat and his cane, you'll know that as a schoolboy he went to Harrow because for the rest of his life he carried on wearing the hat and holding the cane. That tells you that you went to the lesser school. Eton, of course, is better. And you can see that their fathers are wearing the hat because, of course, Dad went to Harrow as well. And Mother's got a bit of bird in her hair because bird. And they all look very confident and very happy. And that's Britain at the height of the empire, the richest place the world had ever known, since Amsterdam was the richest place the world had ever known. And within weeks of that photograph being taken, they were fighting in a war that was supposed to take a few weeks. And then the war went on, and it cost more money. And the only people who had money were the rich. And so we had to bring in taxes and increase the taxes and have more taxes to pay for a war that carried on. And all across Europe, they taxed the rich to pay for the First World War. And then there was a revolution in Russia. And the one great thing a revolution does, if you line people up against a wall and shoot them, is it makes very rich people very worried. And after the war, the elite tried to make their countries a bit better, partly because they were scared of being shot in the revolution. Trade unions became more powerful, loads of organisations became powerful. We had a general strike, we had the international banking crash. I'll show you a graph in a minute of our inequality falling. And after 20 years of falling inequality, things got a little bit better. And this is the kind of bad news about being at the peak of inequality. Here are the graphs for the UK of the share taken by the top. I think it's 1% and 10%. Our best 10%, Dimitris, I, Richard and Kate in England have all been in the top 10%. We take 40% of all income. We leave just 60% for 9 out of 10 of our fellow citizens. That's the kind of country we live in. We worry about what kind of holidays we're going to have a year. How many holidays? Will I have 2 holidays, 3 holidays, or 4 holidays? Most children in England have no holiday a year. None. In fact, it's actually got to the point now where when we ask families about holidays, they increasingly say, I didn't have one, but I don't want one. Why would I want a holiday? Which is very odd if you grew up in more equal times. And if you remember the graph for the Netherlands, you are still down at the best years that we ever had. The problem is that when a country is equal, you don't know what you've got. The UK in the 1970s didn't realise what it had, and then it slowly lost it, and more was taken by the rich. If you remember, I said 1913 was the peak. Half the equality had increased by I think this is 36. And the photograph is different. It's still taken at the annual Harrow-Eton cricket match, but now the boys from Harrow are looking nervous. The working class boys are looking confident. This photograph has appeared on the front of more social science books than any other photograph. Those 2 boys died early. One died within a year of that, the boys with the hats. He had fever in India. And the other one ended up in a mental institution. The 3 working class boys, as far as I know, are still alive. I'm running out of time, so I can't tell you the fascinating history of politics in the UK. But just to tell you that this graph is a graph of the segregation index of Conservative voters. And in the past, Conservative voters didn't live near other voters. And then when we became very equal, there were Conservative voters everywhere, people were more mixed. A bit like the USA in the 1960s and 70s, where there were Republicans everywhere, Democrats everywhere. You might have a friend who's a Republican and Democrat. And now in the United States, it has never been more polarised. They hate each other bitterly. They would kill each other. If you just follow Twitter and look at what Republicans and Democrats say about each other, and they don't live in the same towns or the same streets. Well, the same kind of thing happened in the UK. Conservative areas became progressively more conservative. Labour areas became more Labour, and the graph increases until 2070. And this is the interesting thing about what is happening now. This graph, and we're getting very near to the end of the graphs, you'll be glad to know, and Kate and Richard tell me that they've cut a lot of the graphs from their talk. This graph is showing you swings at general elections. Our biggest swing was 1945. Massive swing, brought in a Labour government, we got a welfare state. The next biggest swing was 1997. That was a swing against 18 years of Conservative rule. It wasn't a swing for Tony Blair. When Tony Blair was standing on his own, not benefiting from the fact that the Conservatives have been in power for 18 years, the country actually voted against him. In 2001, he lost votes. You see it going down. In 2005, Tony Blair lost votes. He wasn't good at elections. He won them because the Conservatives had been so bad, but he lost votes. Paul Gordon Brown lost even more votes in 2010. but that was a giant economic recession. Ed Miliband, in 2015, he got a tiny 1.4% positive swing. And then last year, and this is completely unprecedented in British political history, the fastest, biggest, most dramatic swing in the vote occurred in May and June in Britain's entire history, and the largest swing since the Second World War meant that the Conservative Party lost their majority and Jeremy Corbyn got the biggest support of any Labour leader. And it absolutely shocked his own party, let alone the Conservatives. And Theresa May is now trying to negotiate in Brussels in an alliance with a bunch of people who don't even believe in evolution. That's the Democratic Unionist Party. Because of that swing. Unprecedented things can happen at the peak of inequality. We're living in very interesting times in Britain at the moment. This is a graph showing mortality rates rising. Life expectancy in the UK peaked in 2014. It has been dropping since. I live in the only country in Europe in which life expectancy is dropping. It will drop rapidly very soon because all those young, healthy Europeans are no longer coming. And they've helped make the country look better than it really is. And even worse, the old people who live in Spain, when they get ill, they're going to come back to the UK. For the last 3 years, we've had absolute significant rises in infant mortality. More babies dying each year than the year before. Nowhere else in Europe has rising infant mortality. In 2015, we were 19th in the European League table. We're heading towards 25th now. By 2025, we expect to have worse infant mortality than Romania in the UK. If you want to know what it feels like to be in a country falling apart, that's where we are. This is the graph showing public spending varying across Europe, the big rises of the bailout of the banks. I've run out of time, so I cannot spend any time describing this. But believe you me, France and Finland are not basket cases at the top. Things don't fall apart when you spend that much money. Whereas when you head towards the bottom, things really do spend apart. And remember, we're spending a lot of our public spending on aircraft carriers, nuclear missiles, things like that. Our political debate within the UK between the two major parties, the most radical Labour Party we have had since 1945, and the most right-wing Conservative Party that we have had, who are basically far-right in Europe. They are Allied with Alternative for Deutschland and the Free Finns. The difference between their spending plans is at most 2%. So we're having a political debate about moving that line by 2 percentage points. And that is seen as dramatic. This is the difference in inequality. More equal countries decide to spend things collectively, have good schools, go to the same schools, have decent quality housing, have hospitals that work, have public transport systems that work. The UK has done a great service to Europe. We have shown what happens if you have the most inequality in Europe. We are the highest Gini coefficient of any country in Europe. And we have falling life expectancy and rising infant mortality. The tragedy would be if European countries didn't notice that. You know, what is the point of having all these babies dying if you don't learn from it? And if any politicians dare in the rest of Europe point to Britain and say, oh, we should privatise like them, it's great. Like, we have absolutely wrecked our country for the good of the rest of the world to see what happens if you become nasty, selfish, individualistic. And my worry is that other countries are too nice and don't say, look what goes wrong. The most unequal countries in the world are Brazil, Turkey, Russia, the UK, the USA and Israel. Right? I mean, it's becoming bloody obvious, isn't it, really? So why doesn't Finland and the Netherlands and Japan explain loudly that you don't have to be this stupid? It's because you're too polite, and we're too loud and we're too brash. I've run out of time. Just a few words for you. Things change rapidly when you become this unequal. We're at a turning point in the country. Anything, absolutely anything can happen in the UK in the next 3-4 months. We can go in any direction. We have no idea. We are quietly buying food and saving it. That is what is happening at the moment before the 29th of March. But we can go any way. And I'll just leave you with some optimism. when Jeremy Corbyn was elected leader of the Labour Party, it was said to be a disaster. When he was re-elected as leader, it was said to be a disaster. Finally, the country is beginning to work out that when young people bother to vote for the first time, and when you get this shift, it might not be the biggest disaster that's ever happened to Britain. And lastly of all, I mentioned that disasters tend to help change things. The First World War was the big thing which changed inequality in Europe. For the UK, if it takes a disaster to change things, Brexit is far better than the war. And the more disastrous that Brexit is, maybe we'll realise we've been doing the wrong thing for 30 years, and the problem, all our problems we blame on immigrants, we're about to discover that the problem in Britain has not been the immigrants, and the only way we could discover it is by doing what we're about to do. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. So we have time for maybe 2 or 3 quick questions.
Hello.
Hello.
I'm not sure how this affects your happiness, but the British Parliament just accepted the bill put forward by May. That is not my question. My question is, how do you connect poverty and inequality? Because if you look at Africa, it's a lot more equal than South America, but that's because most people are poor, equally poor. And the second question is, how do you explain some of the paradoxes that you, for example, see manifest in the American elections, where you have a lot of the Trump voters vote for things that would actually make them worse off. For example, the tax bill and also the health care, which would arguably increase inequality, yet the people being at the loosening end of it still vote for it.
Yes. Okay. You're right. In South America has some of the highest rates of inequality in the world. Partly created by the United States, who controlled the countries of South America. And if they ever elected a government that wanted to make things more equal in the 1970s, the Americans arranged a coup to stop it happening. However, South America now has some of the fastest increases in equality in Mexico and in Chile. Most countries in Africa are actually seeing rising equality at the moment. It's very hard to measure because people are going off subsistence income into cities and then getting an income. But there is no successful country in the world which is unequal. It'll be interesting if there ever is, but there isn't one. Whereas as yet, we don't have a country in the rich world which has become too equal. Nothing has yet gone wrong. We need Finland to become more and more equal for something to go wrong, to work out how much equality is too much equality. But at the moment, homelessness is falling in Finland. It has the fastest increase in life expectancy. It has the best educational results. It has the most going to university. It has the highest happiness rate. So the Finns need to become more equal. Why do people in the United States vote against their interests? It's very similar to the United Kingdom. We tell people that the reason why you can't get your child into a good school is that the immigrants, not in this case walking up from South America, the immigrants are getting all the good school places. That's why you can't have a good school. We tell people you can't have a good house because the immigrants are getting the good house. And we tell them you can't have good healthcare because the immigrants are using all the hospitals. It's all lies. But we've been telling people this for 30 years. In the United States, they tell them the same thing. You can lie to people and you can make them scared and you can make them racist. If you're a conservative politician and you believe that inequality is good, and you think just a few people should get a lot and most people should get very little, you don't tell people most of you are thick and stupid and don't deserve much money but vote for me. You tell people, if you let me get rid of the immigrants, I'll make your life wonderful. That's why.
Yep. There's another one at the back.
Thank you. A quick question. You gave a couple of examples of countries with high rates of inequality, but you were speaking about democracies, countries of the Western world. Can you maybe give a couple of words about pseudo-democracies, dictatorships like Russia and Turkey, and how can they deal with their inequality when it stems from within rather than other reasons like immigration or in the United States, as you said, in terms of Latin America and etc. Thank you.
Okay, I mean, the world is interesting because the number of countries that are democracies is now very, very much higher than it was 40 years ago. China's one of the most interesting countries when it comes to pseudo-democracies. China is one of the more equal of the poor countries of the world, but has similar inequality to the USA, which is the most unequal. The UK is not that democratic a country. We have a system of voting where most people's votes do not matter, not a system of voting that the rest of Europe has. And if you look at Russia and Turkey and the UK, we're the three countries with the largest cities in Europe, or on the edge of Europe, and we're also the three countries at the heart of former empires, the USSR, the Ottoman Empire, and the British Empire. So you're looking at kind of decayed relics of former empires. On the issue in Turkey, I won't try and do Russia. The issue in Turkey at the moment is staggering, and the European Union is partly complicit. The European Union has made a deal with Turkey where Turkey will stop Syrians getting out of Turkey, and in return we won't mention that a fascist dictator is taking over whose picture can be seen all over Istanbul, and whose police go into university campuses at the moment, arrest students and imprison them, where the academics do not dare speak in front of their colleagues about what's going on. I was in Turkey last week because they're worried that one of their colleagues, left-wing colleagues, might be a secret spy. So I had conversation after conversation last week with individual Turkish academics who would tell me how terrible things were but wouldn't speak next to their friends. The saddest thing in Turkey, but the European Union are complicit in this. There are 3 million refugees there. Half of them are children, and almost none of those children, 1.5 million Syrian children, are going to school. And some have been there for 6 years. So I think we should worry ourselves about, we are helping Turkey do this. Luckily, I haven't got enough time to try and talk about Russia.
Okay, so we will have more time for questions at the end, but I'd like to have enough time for the last talk, and so we will come back to more questions at the end. Thank you very much.
Good evening. It's a pleasure to be here in your beautiful city and your sensibly organised society. We're very envious, and Rich and I always feel when we're in Europe these days that we should start off by apologising for Brexit. Danny kindly mentioned our book, The Spirit Level, which we published about 10 years ago. And in that book, what we did was show that income inequality is related to a very wide range of health and social problems, that it has really large effects, so that the differences between more and less equal countries are very, very big, and also that everybody is affected by inequality, not just the poor, but also the well-off, the well-educated, and those of high social class. We have a new book out, which was published in June this year. It's called The Inner Level, and it focuses on the pathways through which inequality causes those health and social problems, the ways in which we are all as individuals affected by inequality. So in the brief time that we have with you this evening, we want to just share a few of those findings with you. The book really focuses on how inequality undermines feelings of self-worth, and it strengthens the grip of class and status on all of us. We also spend time busting some of the popular myths which people use to justify high level of inequalities, and we don't really have time to talk to you about that this evening. And we also talk about how to tackle inequality. So perhaps we can pick up some of that in the question and answer sessions. You want to?
I think that some time ago, Kate and I both come at this subject from looking at health inequalities, trying to understand why there are such big differences in life expectancy in different countries. And as researchers around the world began to be aware that stress was an important factor, the biological effects of chronic stress, of course we began to wonder, what are the most important sources of stress in our societies? And that's really what we think we're going to, what we're talking about here.
It was on it.
I think in a way our societies have two very different ideas of reality. You know, if you take a photograph of people, everyone smiles and looks happy as if life is wonderful, as in that top picture. But catch them when they're less aware that they're having their pictures taken, and more often you see these faces that are stressed and haggard and so on. And actually I think there's a lot of truth in the lower picture showing those levels of anxiety and unhappiness and so on. The Mental Health Foundation in the UK did a survey of adults, older and younger adults, and they found that 3/4 of people were so stressed that they had felt unable to cope in the last year. They had also found that about half that number, about 1/3 of the population, had actually had suicidal thoughts in the preceding year. And half that number, 16%, had actually self-harmed sometimes. These are extraordinary levels of unhappiness. You know, if we're talking about well-being and happiness in societies, we must think about these problems. And we think that this is actually telling us or is expressive of very fundamental levels of stress and anxiety in our society. We think, as Kate said earlier, that inequality makes class and status more important. We begin to judge each other even more by where we are in society. The people at the top are regarded as hugely important, and the ones at the bottom almost worthless. And as we judge each other more by status, we worry more about how we are judged and seen. You know, are you regarded as interesting, attractive, clever, and so on, or rather the opposite? And we all have those anxieties about how we're seen and judged, and we believe those are amplified by inequality that contains that idea that some people are worth so much more than others. And actually, where's that graph gone? Oh, no, I mean this one. We haven't got the graph that I thought we had, which shows the levels of status anxiety across income groups. And it shows in all income groups, from the poorest 1/10 of the population to the richest 1/10 of the population. In more unequal societies, people right across the spectrum of incomes have higher levels of status anxiety than in more equal societies. The differences are really quite dramatic. So you see that worry about how you're seen and judged increasing over time with inequality. No, you can do that. Okay.
Oh, right. Sometimes we do this half and half, sometimes we sort of interact a bit, but obviously we're losing the thread a little here. One of the things that has really informed us in our new approach to the evidence on inequality in relation to mental illness is the work of neuropsychologists that has shown that we all, as humans, use something called the dominance behavioural system. We've inherited it from our animal past, but it's stuck with us. And it's how our brain, nervous systems, hormone systems work when we're in positions of either feeling that we are dominant over other people or subordinate to other people. And in every human encounter we have, we make these assessments of where we stand in relation to other people. We make them very, very quickly. Some people have a tendency for dominance. They try to be superior in those relationships. Some people have more of a tendency to be subordinate and submissive. You can link these behaviors to biological markers, and you can link them to mental illnesses. And there's been a large amount of work reviewing how these different biomarkers, these different biological indicators of submission and dominance are related to mental illness outcomes. And what's really interesting is it turns out that you can see in the data different kinds of responses to greater inequality in the prevalence of mental health conditions that we see. So one kind of...
This is the graph.
Oh, sorry, you must have gone backwards.
Yeah, so this just shows the top line, the higher levels of status anxiety right across society. Along the bottom, you've got the different income groups from the poorest tenth to the richest tenth. You see that quite clear that more inequality makes us all worried about our self-worth. And that is very damaging to the quality of social relations, as I'll show you later.
So that status anxiety gets translated into different kinds of responses. So some people, when they're worried about status, they tend to feel more subordinate, they tend to withdraw from social relationships, they feel anxious about their status, they feel anxious about how they're doing relative to other people. And so what we now find in the data is evidence that we get higher rates of depression and anxiety in more unequal societies, whether we look at different US states or different rich countries. So that's one kind of response, a more submissive, subordinate response and higher levels of depression and anxiety. But there's another kind of response as well, because some people try to cope with their status anxiety by being more dominant, expressing their superiority. Does this remind you of anybody? What we actually find is that people are more likely to do what psychologists call self-enhance in more unequal societies, and that's this chart. So if you live in a more unequal society, you're more likely to say that you're better than other people. You're a better driver, you're more intelligent, you're better looking, you're a nicer person than average. And far higher proportions of people say that they're better than other people in more unequal societies. And if we look at US data, where we can track trends over time, we find that as income inequality has increased, so has narcissism. So narcissism has been on the increase in the United States. And we often ask audiences, imagine how terrible it would be if a narcissist rose to a position of power in a major country, and think of the damage that that might do. Because narcissists, although they think they're better than everybody else, they are not. They're not necessarily worse.
I want to now give you an idea of what inequality does to the social relationships between us. And it's particularly important because studies of happiness and also studies of health show that crucial to both those is the quality of relationships. How many friends you have, whether you're involved in community life, the quality of your relationships, one of the most fundamental determinants of whether people are happy or not. And the effects of inequality are really very clear. You see graphs of participation in community life falling away with more unequal societies. On the right are the more unequal societies with lower levels of participation in community life. There are also studies which show that people are less willing to help each other in more unequal societies, less willing to help old people or disabled people. So what you see is the sort of reciprocity, the give and take in a society, our involvement with each other gradually eroding away with more inequality. You also see that people trust each other less. Quite big differences in trust. And on the right there, in the more unequal of these rich developed market democracies, you've got about 15 or 20% who agree that most people can be trusted. In the more equal societies on the left, it rises to 60 or 65%. You in Groningen can feel fairly relaxed about walking home alone at night. In some big cities, in more unequal societies, you have to be aware of who's on the pavement around you, and you probably think it's unsafe in a lot of the big cities. There are also very well-researched rises in violence. These are homicide rates. The red dots are American states. The blue ones are Canadian provinces. And look at the scale of differences there. You've got at the bottom left, in the more equal states and provinces, about 15 homicides per million, and it rises to 150, tenfold differences. There are about 60 papers looking at this relationship in different parts of the world. The tendency for more violence in more unequal societies is pretty well established. But if you go to much more unequal countries than the United States or any of the European countries, places like Mexico or South Africa, you find that people are afraid of each other. They're barricading their homes. Not just one or two houses, but most of them have bars on their windows and doors, fences round the yards, razor wire on top of that, often electric fences as well. And so you can see step by step this appalling erosion of the quality of relationships between us. And unsurprisingly, if you look at the proportion of the labour force involved in what is sometimes called guard labour, the numbers of people who work as security staff or police or prisons increases with inequality. These are the people we use to protect ourselves from each other. And you see the vertical axis is the proportion of the labour force involved in these guard labour jobs. The people we use to protect ourselves from each other as we become more frightened of each other. Really damaging effect.
So we'll just end by saying, or addressing the issue of, do we actually need some level of inequality? Are there any good aspects to having a bit more inequality in society? And for a long time, what economists have told us was that we had to pay the price with inequality to have high economic growth. That's not true. We now have increasing numbers of economists, including Nobel Prize-winning economists, telling us and showing us that actually inequality is bad for growth, it's bad for economic stability, and it gets in the way of poverty reduction. Danny mentioned the World Economic Forum, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank, all now recognizing that inequality is bad for economic growth, whether you want it or not is a different matter, and it's bad for economic stability. Other people have said, well, you've got to have some inequality to drive people's aspirations and make them want to get ahead, and that you'll get more aspiration in more unequal societies. And also, I'm just going to jump on. That's not true, okay? So this is a measure of patents per head, basically a measure of innovation in society. You get more innovation in more unequal societies, probably because you don't waste as much human talent and capabilities because of the effect of stress, anxiety, and all of the other kinds of problems we've shown. And finally, lots of people will say, it doesn't really matter whether you have equality of outcome. What we need is equality of opportunity. As long as everybody have got the same life chances, as long as we live in a meritocracy, then it doesn't matter if we have some inequality. But it turns out that you can't have
that equality of opportunity in more unequal societies. Social mobility is lower in more unequal societies. So far from being able to achieve your potential, move up or down the social ladder and fulfill your capabilities, you're less likely to be able to do that in a more unequal society. So if you're really looking for the land of opportunities, if you'd really like to live the American dream, you should move to Denmark. Or possibly here. So there are no pluses to inequality, and the evidence on the damage that it causes grows more and more robust by the week. We keep being sent new studies linking income inequality to new outcomes. Mass shootings was perhaps the most recent one. I'm working on a paper at the moment on domestic violence. The evidence gets more and more robust. We get more sophisticated studies. It's inescapable. We know about the damage now, and so it's inexcusable if we don't try and do something about it. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. So we have time maybe for questions for the final speakers.
Stay there for questions.
Thank you for such an interesting presentation. Since you were talking about reducing inequalities in countries, sometimes I feel that there is this idea that rich people do not want equality because they fear they will have to share their wealth with, let's say, lazy, poor, uneducated people. So there's also that idea of protecting wealth. So what would be your thoughts about it? Because I also agree that the more equal the society, we are all better off. But sometimes I feel that some countries are very unequal. It's also that hesitance and rejection from higher income people that are like, no, I don't want to lose my wealth, and that the poor or the middle income people are not my problem.
I think those prejudices increase with inequality. I don't think in a democracy we should depend on convincing the top 1%, but as Danny showed, salaries right at the top, I don't like calling them salaries, just a share of income they take, it has reduced in recent years. Interestingly, Anthony Appiah, writing a book called The Honor Code, says that the way you change some of these social practices is to, they change when people cease to regard various social practices, including the super levels of wealth, as sources of distinction, superiority, pride, and so on. I think if we're going to convince the super rich, we have to make sure they know they will be regarded as selfish and greedy. But basically, we don't deal with it by convincing those. We deal with inequality by creating a social movement. And from the 1920s or 30s, the fear of communism, the strength of trade unions, the growing strength of trade unions, the whole labor movement led to a reduction of inequality. People like Roosevelt in the States, when he introduced the New Deal, talked about reforming the system in order to preserve. We cannot reduce inequality substantially without a sustained social movement which makes people in authority, the elite, worried about their continued safety.
Okay, so we have another question for, yeah.
Thank you very much. Professor Picket ended with that we should do something about this inequality, and Professor Dorling said that we should learn from each other. So my question is, why haven't we started to learn from each other on dealing with these problems? And maybe does any of you know how countries could start to learn from each other to fight these issues.
Well, we're involved with a new movement. It's sort of in its beginning. It's called the Wellbeing Economy Alliance. And it's a sort of network of networks, an umbrella kind of organization that's trying to draw attention to the ways in which societies can increase well-being. And one of the things they're trying to do is put together, or bring together, a coalition of countries, regions, states, cities that are trying to do things differently and are having some success to act as champions for well-being and act as a sort of an alternative to the G8, who are just a self-selected bunch of rich people with no proper mandate, rich countries. And the idea is that all over the world there are communities, cities, whatever, that are doing things differently, but not enough of us know about all of the things that are going on in all of the different places. We haven't got anywhere where they're all happening in the same place, but we do know of places that are doing better on things like the environment or things like health. So if we can learn from those champions, then we'll have some, we'll be able to spread some learning. But do you want to talk about economic democracy versus progressive taxes? You do, don't you?
Yes, I mean, there are two ways really of reducing income inequality. Either you redistribute very unequal market incomes through taxes and benefits, or you reduce the differences in incomes before taxes. And the biggest changes in inequality have been due to rising income differences before tax. And the correlation between inequality over time, movements in inequality, and the strength of trade unions is very, very clear. The higher the proportion of the labour force in trade unions, the lower inequality. You see that in one country after another, and of course it's only from the late 1970s, from 1980 onwards, that trade unions are weakened by neoliberal governments. Their strength is whittled away, and of course top tax rates are reduced dramatically, and you get the privatization of utilities and so on. That is when the point at which the left in general lost its way. I think maybe led by Blair in Britain and the idea of New Labour, who thought that inequality didn't matter anymore because people weren't living in terrible squalor. I think that's...
Yeah, I mean, I think from our perspective, well, it's just the truth, actually. This is not fake news. If you have a progressive taxation regime and then you have a change of government, then that can disappear overnight. And so if you're relying on fiscal policy to reduce your income inequality, that's very vulnerable. Whereas if we spread or can encourage the spread of economic democracy, then we can, I think, perhaps get ideas about greater equality more deeply embedded within the culture and within the institutions where incomes are set. And so I think we would favour those kinds of solutions. But that's not to say we don't want progressive taxes.
And they're related. So, in countries with higher top rates of tax, firms don't waste money by paying somebody very highly because most of that money will go to the government. So if you have a high rate of tax, then you get pre-distribution. Picket and Co. found the single most effective thing to keep inequality down and to reduce it is to say that if you earn €1 million a year, we will tax you 60, 70, 80% of that. Not to raise money, not to bring in money for the government, but to stop people saying, I must be paid that much money. And it's very effective. When we took top tax rates down to 40% in England, that's when the bankers started telling us how important they were. They were paid less than doctors. And now bankers are paid 10 times more than doctors in England because they're so important in making Britain so great.
There's another question down here.
Good evening. Thank you for the nice lecture. I'm having a question about the cultural aspect within the inequality countries. For example, we talk a lot about the Netherlands, how good is here, but in the Netherlands, it's also quite judgy when we look at people with very big cars or very big houses. In England, it's the other way around. I mean, people with big houses and big cars are praised on. How do you see the cultural aspect in bringing more equality?
I think that there are some aspects of culture that are independent of inequality, but I think a lot of what we're looking at with examples like that are the effects of inequality. I sometimes get people to think of a set of very unequal countries like Mexico, South Africa, and Russia. They're unequal for very different reasons. Their cultures are extraordinarily different, and yet in each case, the inequality leads to high levels of violence and most of the other ill effects that we've been talking about. So I don't think that culture is key, and indeed a lot of aspects of culture, like the example you gave, are created by the levels of inequality.
So we do find that there's more spent on advertising per person in more unequal countries because you can prey on people's status anxieties more successfully and easily in more unequal countries because people are more worried about their status. In more unequal societies, they do spend more on fancy cars and they do more internet searches for status goods as opposed to, recipes for baking.
So inequality drives consumerism effectively.
Do any of the...
I may get this wrong over... things change over time. So remember, the UK was the second most equal country to Sweden in the 1970s. When as a child, we were more equal in the UK than in the Netherlands. Let's give you one example. I may get this wrong. In the UK now, it is quite common for people with money to pay money to change the number plate of their car. So it says their initials or something else.
They're called vanity plates for a reason.
Vanity plates. You may do it here, I don't know. But as the attitude changed in Britain, trying to explain to people, if you see somebody who's done that to their car, you should feel sorry for them. I know somebody who spent £10,000 who has a cleaner and she's reduced the pay of her cleaner to save money so she can have her initials on her car. Now, while that is admired in a country, you've got a problem. You've got a really bad problem when people think that's the clever thing to do. And the strangest thing about these number plates is when you're in your car driving, you can't see it, right? And it isn't, and I say this, how hard can it be to explain to people, do not spend money getting your name on your number plate of your car, because increasingly the population are thinking very bad things about you when they see that.
Dimitris,
just want to add in response to the question about how countries can learn from each other, or we can add regions and cities learning from each other. A very good example, I think, is the European Union. We tend to forget that one of the key ideals of the European Union is territorial and social cohesion. It's part of the European project. People forget Europe has been scapegoated for a lot of things over the last few years. It can be better, but the fundamentals, one of the fundamentals is social and territorial cohesion, so looking after each other and learning from each other. So I think that's a very good model to build on, and we shouldn't forget.
Dimitris, I've been serving as a commissioner this year on the it's an independent commission for sustainable equality. It's been sponsored by the social and democratic parties across the EU, but it is independent. It reports later this month, and it is a radical report proposing a really positive vision of a social Europe, focused on lots of the solutions that we would all agree are needed, to do with employment and work and social protection. So keep an eye out for that, because it's coming out later this month. And if it's taken on board by the social and democratic parties, a lot of what's in there will be forming, be content for the manifestos of those parties, both nationally when they're fighting elections, but also in the European elections in May next year.
I thought your question was very interesting about why don't we learn. Well, one reason we haven't learned is that 100 years ago in Europe, countries were remarkably similar in how unequal they were. There were servants everywhere. Some of these old houses around here would have servants in the attics. So we were all very unequal, so we didn't have differences. By the 60s and 70s, although there were differences, we were very similar in terms of inequality in these countries. So again, it's only really been opening up in the 80s and then the 90s, this really wide gap. We haven't had it before, so the evidence and it is all coming out now. You couldn't have written the book 20 years ago. The United States is staggering. If you compare Mississippi and Alabama now with the more equal states, they have, things getting absolutely worse in the most unequal ones. But if you went back to the 60s, the differences are actually much smaller between the US states. So this is it's a little bit like, how could you know that smoking was bad for you until you had mass-produced cigarettes and millions of people smoking? And the way we've discovered that inequality is bad is not just a rise in inequality in some countries, but the fact it only happened in some countries. If it had risen everywhere in the world, we would have no idea it was inequality. And if everybody smoked cigarettes, you would have no idea that cigarettes caused lung cancer. You'd actually be finding genetic differences that explain why some smokers died and others didn't.
And it takes a while, for ideas to percolate and become known. So you won't find anybody now who doesn't know that smoking is bad for the health, but you'll still find people in Britain who don't understand the extent of health inequalities and think that the people most at risk of a heart attack are the executives with their stress at the top, whereas we've known for decades now that actually it's the poor and stressed at the bottom. I found that on Amazon you can buy bottles of executive stress formula, a herbal remedy for a non-existent condition. It's probably homeopathic. So it does take a while. And somebody asked about vested interests, really, of the rich. And I think we used to think, really, all we have to do is show that inequality affects, the well-off as well as the poor, and then everybody will see the error of their ways and change things. No, but also that's still not very widely known. I would think most rich people in unequal countries don't know that statistically they would be better off if they lived in a more unequal country, even at their same levels.
The one you can't change is the man. It's almost always the man who makes the money, the very greedy man. Philip Green, thinking in my country. The greedy man who becomes very, very rich, you can't change his view. And he also tends to be very odd. His grandchildren, interestingly, are much more normal. Abigail Disney, there were a series of third and fourth generation children of the super rich in the States who write letters to mayors asking them to raise tax rates because they'd like to live in a more equal society. But individual super rich people who've become super rich themselves tend not to be people. They buy newspapers to promote inequality and to scare you all about the immigrants.
He doesn't mean buy newspapers to read.
No, they own them. And they buy TV channels because they want their message spread. And the thing they never want to be said is that they are a problem. That's why they own Fox and Sky and so on and so on. But it's only the first man. Murdoch's grandchildren will be nice people.
Okay, maybe there was one question down here.
Thank you very much. I wanted to go back to the question of what to do about inequality and your suggestion that we need a social movement in order to tackle inequality or to prevent further inequality. Well, at the same time, I think the graph is gone. The more inequality rises, the less people trust each other, which kind of gives a scary feeling for the possibilities to build a social movement. It kind of feels like an endless trap that goes down and down and down until maybe you get the point where Dorling says you need a war or a Brexit or something else dramatic in order to go around. So would you say that stresses exactly the lesson for us maybe here in the Netherlands as an equal country to prevent had to now build this movement, now we still can, to prevent the levels of inequality falling to the moment that it maybe becomes harder or impossible when trust has fallen between people.
Well, and I'll be very brief, but I can't help. And just see, I mean, how much taller on average can you get? You know, you already are the tallest in Europe. How much thinner? You know, it's related to obesity. You are remarkably thin. That's how I look at you. I don't think of myself as fat because I live in England where I'm normal. But, you know, I think it's really interesting from the point of view of the Netherlands. You know, okay, you're doing very well. It's very good. But just what might be possible for your children and grandchildren. And for you, it's exciting. I mean, for my country, and I've got children, the best we can hope to do in 30 or 40 years is to get like you now. That will be unbelievable. That's the best hope we have. And we're at the bottom of the class. If we try really, really hard, we can be there. But you've got something really interesting you could do. You know, you could actually be the future. And we don't know what that future will be because there isn't that place at the moment. We don't know how tall or fit or happy human beings can be. We don't know, can you educate 80% of people at universities? We have no idea. So I think rather than complaining about, oh, your government taxes you or whatever else, or the immigrants coming from here, why not think, well, what the hell could this place actually be like in future? Because you can do it, you've got much more chance of doing it than places that are in a mess.
Okay, I think we have time for one final short question. I think the lady, she was first, by the wall.
Thank you for possibility to ask questions. Thank you so much for this subject and lectures. It's amazing. And I'm going to speak as a person from Russia that you touched a little bit, and I feel this. I have this feeling to be a citizen of the country that's falling apart, and it's not that nice feeling. And I don't think that people who has power are ready to hear about inequality and equality and what it can bring them. And I also think about the people that we have, and that I don't know if there is some term like this, like culture of inequality, but when many generations have inequality and they think in this, in this surface, so what can I do as a citizen who understand that it's bad and I want to change it, and people who has power, they will not do anything? What can I do? Can I start this movement? I'm not sure that people will follow this. So, yeah.
I think that there's a number of things you can do at an individual level, and students in a number of universities have looked at the scale of pay differences between the rector or the vice-chancellor or whatever at the top and the cleaners at the bottom, and have got universities to pay the living wage to people at the bottom. There's been a widespread movement amongst, pushing companies into paying the living wage. There are also one or two states in the United States which raise corporation tax on companies that have very big differences in income between them. I think there are a lot of ways of doing it, but I also think that the whole of the establishment needs to feel threatened by some kind of social disorder. People in the 1930s, apparently there were an enormous number of riots and wildcat strikes and so on. There was also the fear of communism after the Russian Revolution, and that is said to have been a very important part of why Roosevelt introduced substantial measures to reduce income differences. And of course it's when that whole focus is lost and the left loses its way, union power is weakened, that you get the modern rise of inequality. So I think you have to combine that fear and the sort of work that things like our Equality Trust and the Movement for Living Wage and various other methods have been trying in different parts of the world.
But there's other things we need to do as individuals as well, I think, and that is partly, talk to people we know, share what we learn, so that these ideas do become more widely known. But also, we need to sort of enact the change that we want to see in the world. Most of us live and work in institutions that have some kind of hierarchy in them, where judgments are made about people's worth on the basis of sometimes the things that they own rather than the qualities that they have. So each of us, I think, in all of our interactions with other people, we need to keep this stuff in mind and not judge others for exhibiting qualities that have been produced in them by the structures of society, rather than through any kind of differences in individual worth.
Mm-hmm. Maybe we have very few minutes left, but maybe we can ask the same question to the last two.
Okay, well, a very quick one. There are connections between unequal countries. So one reason that inequality can be so high in Russia and sustained is that the UK allows rich Russians to hide their money in the UK and to buy property with shell companies. And one reason for Brexit are very rich people paying to leave because they want Britain to avoid the European Union regulations that allow rich Russians to hide their money in the UK. So once you get one of these unequal countries to become more equal, it's harder for the other ones to carry on, because if you steal money within Moscow, where are you going to hide that money abroad if that becomes harder to do?
Dimitris, do you want?
Yeah, just very briefly, you asked what you can do. I think what you are already doing, just speaking up here and raising this point, raising awareness and engaging with this, engaging in events like this, in social media, and asking for support and solidarity. I talked about solidarity and happiness. We feel for you, and we really interested in what's happening in Russia. We follow very closely what's going on. There are amazing organizations, and I think we need to keep it up. So I think what you just did is amazing. So that's it.
Great. Okay, unfortunately we are now completely out of time. So I just want to thank all of the speakers for coming and for their very interesting talks. Thank you. And thank you to you all for coming as well.